So today we're fortunate to have Professor Ermin Sinanovic of Political Science Department to illuminate us on a very important area in that region, Malaysia. I personally know Malaysia only because it has perfect diving ground, so I go to Malaysia. I know nothing else about that. Professor Sinanovic originally came from Bosnia and formerly known as Yugoslavia, part of Yugoslavia. And he went to school here in the United States, got his PhD in political science from Syracuse University in upstate New York. And he's been in the political science department for a few years. And his specialty is Islam.
Politics of the Muslim world.
Politics of the Muslim world, which is pretty fitting. So without further ado, Professor Sinanovic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity. So I want you first to retune your accent indicators, whatever it is, kind of stretching from that part of the world English accent to a more Eastern European type English accent. So I hope by now you're calibrated your devices so we can continue. This talk is based on my dissertation research, which I did, as Professor Mao Chun mentioned, at Syracuse University in upstate New York. And I want to start by saying, if this is working, apparently it's not. Just see. OK. By introducing Malaysia, for those of you who might not be that familiar, it's a country in Southeast Asia, as you can see here, bordering Thailand. It's part of that South China Sea basin, if you will. It also borders Indonesia and the very important straits between Malaysia and Indonesia, or the Indonesian island of Sumatra, from where a good coffee comes from, as many of you know, is Strait of Malacca here. It's very strategically important, especially for sea navigation. But that is not part of my talk today. However, I just wanted to let you know about the general geographical position of Malaysia. That is the Malaysian flag, and probably one of the first things that you can notice is that it resembles our flag here, the United States flag, right? To some extent, with just one star, but many stripes. So why this topic? Why Islamic revival in Malaysia? I think by now, talking about this in 2008, no one really needs to be convinced about the resurgence of Islam, global resurgence of Islam. I remember when I started dealing with this topic, and that was really prior to 9/11. Studying Islam and dealing with Islam wasn't really something that was considered really that interesting. It was only after 9/11, and we have these periodic events in our history when we become more interested in that part of the world. You know, 1979, the Iranian Revolution, then the 9/11. But in between, we tend to forget a lot of things. So when I started doing this topic, it wasn't that interesting. I found it interesting for many reasons, one of which was I'm in general interested in issues of political and social change, how political and social change happens. And that is one of the big topics, if you will, in comparative politics that we do. We study political change. One of the big topics is, of course, democratization, how that political change happens, transitions from one regime or political regime to another, from one type of government to another. But also we study social changes as well. And one of the big social changes that has happened in the Muslim world in the past 30 or 40 years is this Islamic revival, which is resurgence, reassertion of Islam and its teaching, not only on individual level, but also in the public and social spheres and political spheres. So these are the two main topics, big topics that really preoccupied my academic interest, if you will. That is an example. I think it's one of the mosques in Malaysia, and it's a beautiful example of Southeast Asian Islamic architecture, if you will, because it combines elements of, you know, what is traditionally understood to be Islamic architecture, which is very Middle Eastern influence, but also more of a Southeast Asian type of historical influences. It's a very beautiful example here that you can see. So what do we mean by Islamic revival? It is a process through which, or in which, Islam becomes important again. Now, this requires a little bit of clarification. What do you mean by Islam becoming important again? Wasn't Islam always very important in Islamic societies? Well, it was. But at the end of the 19th century and for the first part of the 20th century, Islam really took back seat. It was the time, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the traditional Islamic forms of government, and the establishment of new independent nation states. And the concepts such as nationalism took really a front seat, and not Islam, in the nation building of many of these countries. However, after having tried some of these new developments and some of these new concepts, some of the Muslim countries or people in the Muslim countries kind of felt that it wasn't really delivering, that nationalism wasn't delivering, that many of the things that they've tried in the meantime were not delivering the kind of promises that they promised in the first place, you know, the political, economic, social development, post-independence kind of development that many of these nationalistic regimes promised in the Muslim world. And so people felt that they need to reinvent their societies. And part of that is turning back to religion and trying to find what Islam says about all these things, what Islam says about development, what Islam says about politics, economics, and so on and so forth. And to the point where today, for instance, in many Muslim countries, you have a phenomenon of Islamic banking, where it's a separate issue. I don't want to go into that much, but it's basically infusing a modern banking system with some of the teachings and precepts of Islam. That's a separate topic. I don't want to go into that too much. So religion, through this process of Islamic revival, acquires a higher profile in society and politics. So I started this question of Islamic revival in Malaysia, which is a part of that global phenomenon, but also has really interesting specifics, if you will, in the Malaysian context. And Malaysia, just like many other Muslim countries, had witnessed Islamic revival, especially starting with the late 60s and through the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, where people felt that their commitment to Islam needs to be reestablished, if you will. Again, not only on individual level, but also in public sphere. That Islam has something to say about politics. Islam has something to say about the economy. Islam has something to say about society, and many, many other things. And in the literature that I reviewed on Islamic revival, most of it, especially the one that was written prior to 9/11, cited these reasons as reasons for Islamic revival. So you have unemployment, you have poverty, you have misrule, which means bad governmental rule and so on, lack of opportunities, underdevelopment, and all of these things make people dissatisfied to the point that they turn back to the only really stable thing in life they know, and that is religion. There could be a kind of more philosophical critique of this that I could deliver, but we don't have time to delve into that, to relate it to theories of secularization and modernization. We don't have the time for all that. Why people felt that these were really the primary reasons for that Islamic revival. So you have this notion that the failure of modernization in Islamic societies leads to Islamic revival, and that Islamic revival is reaction to modernization. While there is something to this story, my problem with this argument is that this argument doesn't explain how this jump from, say, nationalism to Islamic revival takes place. It is assumed that it's almost automatic. If you have failure of modernization, people automatically become more Islamic, as if it's very deterministic. And in social sciences, we try to probe deeper into these processes and try to find the mechanisms how this really happens. So that's the first kind of idea. The second idea behind Islamic revival, that Islamic revival is kind of rejection of Western cultural values. And here is one of the people who had promoted this idea strongly, Bernard Lewis of Princeton University. And there's much to be said about Bernard Lewis and his philosophy being adopted, especially for the Iraq War. But that, again, is another critique, perhaps to be saved for some other time. While, again, there is something related to rejection of Western cultural values to Islamic revival, again, the whole phenomenon, which is really multifaceted, cannot be explained by simply saying, oh, these people reject Western cultural values and therefore they turn to Islam. Again, it's very deterministic. It looks at just one cause. It's this monocausality that attributes to the process of Islamic revival, that there is this one thing that somehow triggers these people into some sort of a safe mode where they return to religion and go back to it. There is something of it. But there is a kind of a universal critique of what is being described, especially in the works of people like Bernard Lewis, of Western cultural values. We even have people in our own society, in the United States, who criticize what is often seen as Western cultural values. More conservative, especially segments in the society, tend to have some problems with some of these values as well. So it's not something that is, again, particularly related to these Islamic societies. Again, as I said, the problems with these theories is that they are deterministic. They don't really account, they cannot explain the jump that happens, let's say, from underdevelopment to Islamic revival. They say, well, one of the causes for Islamic revival is underdevelopment in Islamic countries. Okay, can you please describe the process that leads from underdeveloped to Islamic revival? Because if that is enough, then every country that is underdeveloped should have some sort of revival. And that argument cannot stand on the empirical grounds. And also, that would also assume that countries that exhibit good economic and political development will not have an Islamic revival. And I have chosen Malaysian case precisely for one of the reasons, is because it shows a case where Islamic revival and economic development actually went hand in hand. Other solutions were actually implemented and tried. It's not that just people jump directly from, say, underdevelopment to Islamic revival. They had underdevelopment in the 1920s, 1930s. They tried nationalism. They tried other ideas, liberalism. Egypt was actually, in terms of social thought, was very liberal in 1920s, 1930s. It didn't have a liberal government because it didn't have a government of its own at that time. I just saw a book being published actually on liberal thought in Egypt, 1920s, 1930s. Liberal ideas were circulated in those countries. And at some points have even been tried, especially those that are more related to nationalism. And nationalism and liberalism are not mutually exclusive, as I'm sure many of you know. So again, there is no automatic jump from underdeveloped to Islamic revival. There must be something else going on. And that something else, as I'm trying to argue, is that Islamic revival is best explained by using ideational logic of explanation. And I will explain just a little bit what that means. That is, Islamic revival, I'm using here abbreviation, and people in international relations would feel that this is sacrilege as I'm using IR for Islamic revival, is the product of certain ideas and teachings derived from Islamic religion by Muslim revivalists who carry these ideas. And I will qualify this argument a little bit later to explain what I mean by this. I mean, you could say, yeah, ideas matter, ideas are appropriated by people, but you would be actually perhaps surprised to learn that in political science, and much of political science, at least until recently, ideas didn't really matter that much. We studied institutions, right? We study many other structural theories. But ideas, until recently, were not admitted into the mainstream of political science, until fairly recently. I mean, you have this new institutionalism and kind of jump to the what I call ideational logic of explanation in comparative politics. But of course, ideas are always there. How ideas are being propagated and appropriated and disseminated, diffused and accepted is really what matters. And this is really the meat of my argument, if you will, that I will talk about in a while. So the case of Malaysia, for one, it illustrates the global nature of Islamic revival. And also is an interesting example where Islamic revival and economic development went hand in hand. The people who produced Islamic revival and were the, if you will, the torch carriers of Islamic revival were not the poor, uneducated people, were actually among the most educated people in their societies. And that goes against this whole idea of how this some sort of underdevelopment and poverty and all that causes or is used to best explain the Islamic revival. In my approach, especially from a theoretical perspective, I use several aspects of both comparative politics and international relations theories. From comparative politics, I use what I call ideational logic of explanation, and unfortunately, I don't have much time to go into that. But basically, it's this idea that ideas matter and that ideas can have their own causal logic, which then in the literature that talks about these issues is explained and what is meant by that. And I don't want to go too much into that. First of all, this is not a dissertation defense, and it's not a job talk. I don't have to be that theoretically smart to deliver this talk. So I'm going to skip on that. That's usually the part of the talk that matters only to really a few people. But if you have questions later on, I would be more than willing and happy to explain that. From the international relations theory, I have used the constructivist approach, which is basically about norms and ideas, that norms and ideas and beliefs matter, and how these inform behavior, say, of political actors. And they're used especially in international relations, but they could be used, I think, also in comparative politics. And I also use social movement theories, and especially within the social movement theories, the part of the social movement theories that talk about the framing processes. Now, what are these framing? Framing, socialization, mobilization. What are the framing processes? The framing process is basically how any political actor frames their ideas, how they frame any given issue. And we will see in the Malaysian case that the way in which the Malaysian Islamic revivalists framed their ideas really mattered. And it's really what made people to respond to those ideas. So framing in social movement theory is extremely, extremely important. Doesn't have anything to do with pictures or anything like that. It's not that type of framing. So in my argument, I trace the sources, the evolution, acceptance, and dissemination of these ideas to show a logical kind of process, how these ideas are being created, if you will, by these idea entrepreneurs, if I could use that term, and then how they are disseminated and why they are accepted. And if I'm able to explain that, and I obviously think that I am, then I would have, give a good account of how this whole process happens. So let's see how well I did with this. So I'm focusing, when I say ideas, I'm focusing on what I call middle range of programmatic ideas. If you think of ideas, you can have a very specific idea, such as policy. Let's say someone's stance on abortion is an idea, a very specific kind of policy-oriented idea. Or you could have, on the other hand, other side of the spectrum, you could have political ideologies, this kind of grained claim set of ideas that cohere together, cohesive, explain political beliefs and values. In between those, there are certain ideas that might assume some characteristic, might propose certain specific policies, but are at the same time based on certain philosophical generalizations, such as like ideologies are. And these kind of middle range ideas are really what I'm concerned about. They can be used to prescribe certain policies, but they are not really themselves political ideologies. So I call these ideas middle range programmatic ideas. They influence specific policies, and they also determine the range of possible actions. And I also look at the ideas diffusion. If I am to say, look, there are certain ideas that certain people proposed in order to create what later on came to be known as Islamic revival, I have also to account for the process of how they were able to spread those ideas among many other people. And that's what we mean by ideas diffusion. So I look also at socialization, at framing processes, as I've already mentioned, at social learning, and at norm localization. This norm localization is extremely important. Why am I saying that? Well, in order to sell an idea to someone, you have to tell them why that idea is important in their own local context. So if these Malaysian revivalists were to sell the idea of Islamic revival, some of which is acquired from other Islamic thinkers outside Malaysia, they have to be able to explain to people in Malaysia, to the Muslims in Malaysia, because that is their audience, why these ideas are important in their own context. This is where norm localization takes place. If there is no such component in their explanation, in their effort to spread these ideas will not spread. This actually is so important. It goes back to issues of promoting democracy in whatever country you want to talk about. Without normal localization, forget about it. Forget about it. So it's extremely, extremely important. OK, so what are some of these ideas of Islamic revival? Well, these are some idea entrepreneurs, if you will. None of these three persons that I mentioned here are Malaysians. The first person is Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. You have Muhammad Iqbal, who was a famous Indian philosopher, poet, writer, Islamic scholar, if you will. And you also have Maududi, who was the founder of the Jamaat Islami, the famous Pakistani Islamic movement. What were these ideas that these people propagated and were later adopted by Malaysian Islamic revivalists and then localized for the Malaysian audience, if you will? Well, the two main ideas on which perhaps every effort at revival and reform in the Muslim world in the past 14 centuries was framed, within which. But again, it had to be localized and contextualized for whatever time and place it was implemented in. The first such idea is the idea of renewal, known as tajdeed in Arabic language. What is this tajdeed? Well, this tajdeed, the idea of renewal, is actually based on a prophetic saying where in Islamic sources it is said that the Prophet Muhammad said that God will send to this community, meaning to the Muslim community, on top of every 100 years, a person who will renew their religion for them. So there is an inbuilt kind of assumption in Islam that the community will over time kind of waver or falter in their adherence to Islam, and that from time to time there will be people, not prophets, because prophets, according to Islamic religion, have stopped with the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad. But you know, kind of people who are kind of more ethically and morally aware of the situation and the needs of their society, who would then go and propagate what this tradition at least proposes is kind of authentic type of Islam. And this notion of authenticity is a big, big part of the revivalist discourse. The second part of this proposal for reform and revival is the notion of reform itself, which in Islam is known as Islah. It is a word that was being mentioned in the Quran, it was mentioned in the prophetic traditions, it was mentioned in Islamic sources. And by reform, and here is something that I want you to understand, they don't mean the type of reform like we had in the West, like Reformation. By reform, they mean bringing society to the proper practice of religion as envisioned by these revivalists. It's not reforming religion to conform with what society wants. It's actually looking at the society, finding what's wrong with it, and bringing it back to religion. That is the understanding of Islamic revival and reform that really was generic understanding of every attempt that happened many times in Muslim history, including this contemporary part. But the new idea that these people brought, in addition to these two ideas that were present, which they also kind of contextualized for the time that they lived in, is the idea of Islam as a comprehensive way of life. What they call Islam as ad-din. Ad-din is a world religion in Arabic, but really it means much more than that. It means what we would loosely translate in contemporary English as way of life. Basically saying, look, if Islam is the way of life, that is their assumption, then Islam has something to say not only about spirituality and your relationship with your Creator and your salvation in the hereafter, but it also has something to say about politics. It also has something to say about the way you arrange your family relations, your social relations, your political relations, your economic relations. Islam has to say a little bit about each of these aspects of life. And that is where they bring this notion of Islam as an ideology. Basically, it's an all-encompassing ideology that really, really permeates every aspect of human activity. So these are the people that brought these ideas internationally. In the Malaysian context, the Malaysian Islamic revivalists really started their operations, if you will, in the 1960s. Some of it was indigenous to Malaysia. Obviously, Malaysia had a tradition of Islamic learning and scholarship from before, but also much of it was acquired from many of these writers like Hassan al-Banna Mawdudi, Sayyid Qutb, Muhammad Iqbal, and many other Islamic leaders. So you have this kind of domestic Malaysian scholars, and you also have the Indonesian link. Malaysia is in proximity to Indonesia, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is the most populous Muslim country in the world. It has a long tradition of Islamic learning. And Malaysia and Indonesia, because of their culture, language, and history, have strong historical links. And so the Indonesian link was also very important here. Some of the Indonesian scholars' ideas were adapted into Malaysian revivalist discourse. In addition to that, the Malay students abroad who studied overseas also used to bring some of these ideas. Interestingly enough, many of these did not study in what we call the Muslim world or the Middle East or so on. Many of them actually studied in the West, and especially the UK, but also in the United States, where they came in touch with other Muslim revivalists from Egypt, from Syria, from other parts of the Muslim world. And it was actually for the first time that many Malay scholars and students came in touch with these revivalist ideas. And so they acquired these ideas from other Muslims in the UK and the US, Muslims who came to study also in these countries. And then after completing their course of study, would go back to Malaysia and propagate these ideas. So you see how this is indeed a transnational effort, a transnational, if you will, phenomenon. You cannot understand Malaysian Islamic revival without understanding the transnational component of it. Usually in my classes, and I know that the midshipmen don't get enough sleep, or perhaps they give you some kind of injection when you join the Naval Academy where they make you feel asleep during certain periods, I ask my students to stand up for a kind of maybe 10, 20 seconds. So would you do me that favor and do that here? It's also good for your blood circulation, by the way.
That means half time.
OK, well, I can see everyone is in much better mood right now. So you can sit down and let me put you back to sleep again.
We're revived.
In addition to these moments that I've already explained, these theoretical approaches, there is also a very important moment in explaining Islamic revival, any kind of social change, and that is the moment of crisis. That usually social changes happen when there is a crisis in the society. Maybe that'll be a good, we'll wait until November 4th to see if that template could be used to explain what is going on in this country. But usually there is a crisis, there is some people start asking themselves, what went wrong? What can we do better? And we can see that even in our country, we are doing that right now. In Malaysian context, the crisis was really the ethnic riots of 1969, where Malaysia is a multi-ethnic country. It has a Malay majority, but it also has the Chinese and the Indian minorities. And they have found a way to coexist and cooperate together, but also from time to time there are also flare-ups. There are also times when the communities mistrust each other. And one such time happened in 1969. And so this crisis that happened in 1969 led many Malays, actually, who are Muslims, to ask themselves, what is really the problem here? And this is where these Islamic revivalists, these students and scholars came in and said, you know, what's the problem here? The problem here is that really we are not as good Muslims as we should be. We should not look at all these different ideologies and ideas being introduced into our countries. We should look into Islam because that's a part of our identity, who we are. And we should derive the kind of prescription for our own society from our own identity, from the ideas that we are familiar with. And that notion of crisis is extremely important. So this is the time when these ideas are propagated on campuses in Malaysia, among the students, among the educated people. There's a lot of debate going on, people writing for newspapers and magazines and writing books and giving lectures in mosques and in universities where they propagate these ideas and try to mobilize the people. And this leads to a formation of the Malaysian Youth Association, known by its Malaysian acronym as ABIM, who kind of adopted this idea of Islam as a comprehensive way of life, Islam as a deen, and tried to introduce and propagate these ideas in the Malaysian context. In addition to that, I've also mentioned that we really need to account for ideas diffusion. One of the ways in which ideas are diffused among the students was this Usra method. Usra in Arabic means a family, a close circle. And basically is a group of people coming together to study the scripture, to contemplate on the Quran, to study prophetic hadith, traditions, and so on and so forth. But with revivalists, this took additional dimension. In addition to that, they also propagated these ideas of that Islam is really a way of life. It's not just about studying the Quran and becoming more spiritual. It's also about doing something for your, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, for your country, for your religion, for your society, if you will. So this Usra method was really used by the revivalists. So this is an example of a lecture in a mosque of how it takes place. It's basically you have a teacher and they go over certain verses. And if this teacher tends to be more socially oriented, more revivalist, if you will, if their approach, they would also include in their interpretation of the Quran and the prophetic tradition these revivalist ideas. Also the issue, social learning persuasion. You know that campuses are, and here as midshipmen, you know that too well, and I'm talking primarily midshipmen here now, is there is something about peer pressure. There is also something about trying to abide by kind of unwritten rules of the game. And if you see that many other people around are, let's put it in Malaysian context, are revivalists, other students, you kind of feel, I should join them. I should also become a part of the group, right? And this is where that social learning persuasion takes place. You know, why don't you join us? Why don't you join, sit with us, let's study, let's read the Quran, its blessing, and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, they acquire these revivalist understanding. And finally, this normal localization that I mentioned earlier. This is extremely important. And here is how they used to sell their ideas. They would say, look, Malaysia is a relatively poor country. And the Muslims in Malaysia are actually the poorest of all the groups. And the reason for that really is that we have forgotten about our Islamic teachings. So we need to go back, revive Islamic teachings to kind of reacquire that kind of honor that we need to have and dignity to find ourselves better place in this society. So they're trying to sell these revivalist ideas by making them relevant for Malaysian or to the Malaysian context. One of the places where they did that was so-called Risala, which was a newsletter issued by ABIM, that Malaysian movement that I already mentioned, in which they propagated these ideas. This was widely read. I think at the height of its fame, if you will, they had they used to distribute about 10 to 15,000 copies and then multiply that by 2, 3, or 4 people who usually read such things. You get 50,000 people who are exposed to these ideas. Then multiply that by number of people in their family, in their mosques, and it starts taking off, right? And in order to have that moment to take off, in order to make this really salient, really important, you have to have strong leadership. And this is where you'll find that this component in Malaysian Islamic revival was satisfied by the emergence of Anwar Ibrahim, who was the first leader of ABIM, that Malaysian Islamic movement, and was really the kind of a poster boy, of poster child, if you will, for Islamic revival through the 1970s. He was the leader of Islamic revival. And under his leadership and his charisma, his ability to influence people, to persuade, to sway, to mobilize, this Islamic revival took off. So let me just try to conclude this. So this is basically what I'm talking about. You have the crisis, and then people start proposing solutions to the crisis. One of the solutions is this solution that the revivalist proposes. Let's go back to the Quran. Let's go back to the Hadith. Let's try to find out what our religion says to that. And find in those sources, through that renewal process, reform solutions, which then start being disseminated. And as I said, this leads, if these components are satisfied, the emergence of charismatic leadership as well as mobilization takes place, then it leads to other issues, other moments in revival that I will explain. I'm coming to the close of to the end of my lecture. In addition to all of these, I've already indicated there are also transnational influences coming from Indonesia, Malay students studying in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and a really important figure in this, because he forged very close relationship with Anwar Ibrahim, was Ismail al-Farouqi, who actually used to teach here in the United States, and he was actually teaching at Temple University, and he was assassinated in 1986 in his house. It was a robbery attempt, and someone basically killed him. And the group around the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which incidentally has its headquarters still until today in Herndon, Virginia, not far away from here. So if you want to learn more about that, you can actually go there and find a lot of materials there and documents and their books and what they're trying to do. So you have all of these things coming together. You have that emergence of leadership. You have this norm diffusion and all of that. And then that critical mass really takes place, especially with the return of these students who studied from overseas, and you have that takeoff phase. And then it is here where we start talking about mass movement, where Islamic revival really becomes something that is so obvious and so visible in that society. Many of these students who would come back from their studies abroad would plug themselves into the existing Islamic organizations and groups, and the kind of the net effect of all these people coming together is led to this really mass Islamic revival in Malaysia, where all of a sudden you have demands to make sure that the food is prepared according to Islamic standards. Women more and more turn to kind of more traditional conservative clothing. You have some of the Islamic teachings introduced into Islamic banking. You have the call to institute some of the aspects of the Islamic law into the constitution, and so on and so forth. Many, many other things. So here is the rest of that process. You have the taking off phase, but then during that, you start having this mass movement, and with this mass movement, you start having differences of opinions. How do we go after this? And it is here, and this process needs to be broken down further, which hopefully, if I have time and life and will, I might try to do. I'm not sure if I will do it. You will have all these different solutions. You have this mass movement, so what do they want to do? Some people would say, let's join the government, and let's work with the government to try to bring more Islam. Some people say, oh, you know what, the government, if they really wanted it, they would have implemented it by now. Let's join the opposition and try to work. Some people say, you know what, neither the government nor the opposition are good enough. We have to bring down all this and start anew. And this is where you start having these differences. And this really needs to be studied in more details. So, to conclude, I think, and obviously I'm giving you here really a snapshot of that overall argument and the work, is that ideas do matter, that in my opinion Islamic revival is best explained by using ideational approach. But I'm not saying that it's ideas all the way and that only ideas matter and nothing else. I think that ideas are more salient in the initial stage, where you have that response to the crisis. Later on, actually, the structure starts taking more importance. And I think when it comes to explaining this, this last part of my chart, where you have multiple interpretations of social change, it is really not so much the ideas, but it is structure here that really, and the interpretations of that structure that gives variation here. So I think to some extent my argument also involves this account of this interplay between structure and ideas. I think one of the best ways, if not the best way, to understand Islamic revival is to understand it as development. That it is a kind of political development, that this is people in those countries saying, look, how do we want to develop our countries politically, economically? This is their response to all that. So here is kind of that chart. If I put it all in one succession, it would be too small. So it starts here and then continues over there. And I think with that I conclude. I've taken a little bit more time than allocated, but I'm a social scientist, and you will excuse me for that.
Well, thank you very much. The most popular major here is political science, and we know why. Because most of you are engineers like charts and equations. Political science has everything. We have time for questions, and I think since it's been videotaped, so if you could repeat the question, so the question will be
okay, recorded.
Yeah. Here.
Yes.
So have you noticed, you said that it wasn't really due to like underdevelopment in a lot of Muslim countries, the reason for this Islamic revival. Have you noticed the difference between like different kinds of Muslim revivals? Like you said that Malaysia is the connection between the economic growth and Islam. Is that more of like a not as conservative Islamic revival as opposed to an Islamic revival in an underdeveloped country which is more radical?
Thank you very much for the question. The question is, if I understand it well, about different Islamic revivals, basically. And is Malaysian Islamic revival different than Islamic revivals in other Muslim countries? Definitely, I think one of the big themes in the history of Islamic societies is diversity and pluralism. And so when we talk about Islamic revival, there isn't one template for Islamic revival in all Muslim societies. There is a lot of diversity even within Islamic revivals. And because you'll remember that I mentioned this issue of normal localization, that Islamic revival, if it is to be successful, it has to speak, it has to talk to the local conditions, then by necessity they will have certain different components and different manifestations in different Muslim societies. There are obviously issues that are shared, especially the beginning process is, I think, very similar in every Muslim society, this idea of understanding of renewal or reform. And in contemporary Islamic revival discourse, this idea of Islam as a way of life is, by and large, generally accepted. But the way then how it is manifested later on is really, there are differences and variations in different societies. I think one of the reasons why Malaysian Islamic, and there are many, Islamic revival might be a little bit different than, say, Islamic revivals in Middle Eastern countries is obviously it's a different country. It has there's something to be said about the British colonialism and the institutions that they leave behind. And Malaysia was known as Malaya, and it was a British colony. And the institutions that they left behind led to a more kind of institutionalized and procedural politics in former British colonies, of which Malaysia was part. Then in, say, Middle Eastern countries in which you had, to a large extent, a benign neglect by the colonial regimes and a very authoritarian approach to the government. So part of it is that. Part of it is the nature, historical nature of Islam in Malaysia tended to be much more community-oriented. It tended to be much more spiritual and mystic, if you will. But that shouldn't be taken too far. Again, I've seen people do that. So there could be many reasons, but definitely there are differences. And I think part of it is that, you know, it goes back to leadership. I think, you know, for what it's worth, Malaysia was blessed with leadership that had the interest of people in mind as well. They really cared about economic development. And they set a chart for the country as a whole. So they really said that the competition was really who will provide better economic development. And if you can provide it and justify it by Islamic teachings, then that was okay. But really, that was one of the measures. And I think that really defined why Islamic revival in Malaysia had some characteristics that we did not really, or we have not seen in other Islamic revivals in other countries. Yes?
How you doing, Professor? I was wondering if you could at all apply your thesis to so-called Islamic, I don't know if you want to call it an Islamic revival or not, but the increase in Islamic society within the U.S. prison system.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any relationship between, at a national level, Islamic revival and in this case?
So the relationship, can this thesis be applied to Islam in America? Is that your question?
Specifically the prison system.
The prison system. I think there is some applicability of this thesis in the prison system. I mean, obviously the most famous example of Muslims coming out of prison was Malcolm X, right? That was the most famous example. And part of it goes through that same process. You know, there is a problem, there is a crisis, if you will, and how to answer to that crisis. To go beyond that, I really cannot do. But I can see parallels. I can see similarities between. Obviously, I am aiming with my argument at some sort of generalizability, but I'm also aware that every argument also has its own specific nature. So I would allow for some generalizability, including in, say, the US, including the prison system. There are some parallels. Yes?
In Christianity, there are teachings about poverty, going back to, say, Calvin, Protestant, that if you're poor, it shows that you're not one of God's elect, or that if you're impoverished, you haven't performed well as a human being. But what about Islam and poverty? Isn't the idea rather that dignity and honor are perfectly possible to a person in an impoverished life? And so I'm trying to make a connection now between Islam and development. Would the religion make some sort of a popular pressure for development, or might the religion instead say, no, a perfectly dignified and honorable life is possible outside of economic endeavor?
It's a really layered answer to that. One of which is that, on the one hand, in traditional Islam, there is that idea that you accept your lot in life and you submit to God's will and you trust that God has His wisdom why you ended up being the way you are, right? And I think you can find that in almost any religion. There is part of that. And I think here is where this contemporary Islamic revival is different. They have taken a verse from the Quran which says that God will not change the condition in which people live unless they change themselves. And what they have said with this, now, the traditional interpretation of that verse was kind of a negative take on it. If you are in a kind of situation, whatever it is you are, it is because God wills, and only God can change your situation. What they have said is that, no, really, the verse says that people can change their condition. So it's not about, you know, fatalistic attitudes and accepting whatever it is. You can change your life, and actually God wants. So in that way, it is much more Protestant, if you will. It goes very much to this notion of, you know, in the way that, for instance, Protestantism and capitalism are intertwined, especially in America. I think there is something to be said. I mean, we are seeing now in Turkey, even in Malaysia, this kind of Islamic capitalism emerging. You know, and capitalism and prosperity are tied, and of course it takes kind of extreme manifestations, like some people are talking about Joel Osteen and his, you know, prosperity church. That's a very extreme manifestation of that phenomenon. You know, if you, you know, if you get something good, that means God loves you. You know, which, you know, then by a different understanding is that if you're poor, that means God doesn't love you somehow. But yeah, there is that. I think contemporary Islamic revival took that traditional understanding and kind of turned it a little bit around and said that really humans have the ability, God-given ability, to change their condition, and God will help them. If they try to do it to improve, then God will be on their side to help them improve their conditions.
That's a Protestant motto almost. Heaven helps those who help themselves.
Almost, I mean, almost. You could say. I always say almost because I don't want to take these parallels too far. People to take and say, well, it's exactly like. There are always important differences, but there are similarities. And that brings us to a higher level, which is the whole issue of secularization, modernity, and what that means, and how it influences these revivals in different traditions. But that's a much more philosophical question. Yes?
I was wondering, with regard to like the idea of Ali and like freeing, I would assume that includes a revival of the Sharia law, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the interplay with that and the civil law and how those have kind of managed to coexist or progress currently.
Once again, please.
Sorry. I'm assuming with the like idea of reverting back to Islamic ideas about social things and laws, that would bring about a rise in, or I guess, renewed emphasis on Sharia law and how that's worked out in Malaysia, I guess, either in competition with or against civil law, and like how Muslims have managed to balance Sharia law versus the
Yes. Well, the question is basically about how this Islamic revival leads to the demands for the introduction of the Islamic law, the Sharia, right? I think you've really pinpointed one of the main issues that the revivalists are promoting. And that is, at the essence of their proposal for reforming the society is this notion that society any reform would also necessitate a legal reform. And the legal reform, according to them, is going back to Islamic law. Now, there are various multiple interpretations of Islamic law. I'm sure you're aware of that. But definitely one of those interpretations, according to revivalists, has to be adopted. And of course, there is tension between the common civil law, which in Malaysia is based on the British law, and the Islamic law. So that is why, for instance, on the one hand, there are people who say, you know what, the whole issue of civil law, that whole body of law has to be replaced with Islamic law. There are other people who say, no, there are many provisions in British law that actually don't go against Islamic teaching. So what you need is basically to try to harmonize Islamic law and the civil law. The question is, of course, what happens when there is a tension, where there is, you know, unresolvable contradiction between the two. Which one should take precedence? And it's been, and it still is, a big controversy in Malaysian political life, especially when it involves the non-Muslims in Malaysia. So yeah, it is a huge, huge issue and still is. Obviously, that's a very general answer, but I don't want to go into specifics. But I hope it gives you an overview. Yes?
So just a two-part question. One of it is that, do you think that the war on terror has helped to accelerate this Islamic revival in Malaysia and, you know, in general, the Islamic countries? And also that, like, in Malaysia, despite like all these years where they have enforced things, they put things like Bumiputra policies and stuff, that the Chinese and the Indian communities are still more well-to-do than economically than the Muslim community. So do you think that also helps to speed up the process?
Okay. Two parts of the question, right? The first part about the war on terror. The second part about the affirmative action, Bumiputra policies in Malaysia, right? Interestingly enough, when it comes to Malaysia and Indonesia, this, not the war on terror itself, but the 9/11 and also the brutality of the Taliban regime had actually helped the Malaysian and the Indonesian government and the constituencies which they serve to really single out this radical, violent Islam as really a huge problem in those societies. In the first democratic elections after 9/11 in Malaysia, the Islamic Party really suffered badly. Part of it is because people were frightened. They said, look, if we elect these people to our governments, are we going to get Taliban? Are we going to get 9/11s in our country? So it really worked the other way around. The war on terror, however, did the opposite. It gave the ammunition, if you will, for these people to mobilize more, because they would say, look, the US is now fighting Islam. They wouldn't say they are fighting the Taliban and so on and so forth. And therefore, the Muslims have to come together and they have to turn to Islam. So the 9/11 itself had a positive impact to marginalize the radicals. And I would say that the following war on terror had actually brought these people back. Interesting. The second thing about the Bumiputra policies, which are the affirmative action policies for the majority, interesting concept, in Malaysia, for historically understandable reasons. Well, I think if you look at the three main communities in Malaysia today, the Malays, the Indians, and the Chinese that you mentioned, I would say that the Malays, who are by definition Muslims, are not as well off as the Chinese, but are doing better than the Indians. So I think, if anything, the whole notion of Islamic revival would get more credibility, because they would say, look, we have improved our economic lot in the past 20, 30 years, at the same time that we have become better Muslims, whatever that means. But so they would say that, you know, we should just continue this way. Many people would argue that's the way to go. So it could provide some justification and some encouragement to the revivalists in Malaysia to say, look, only when we started applying these Islamic teachings and so on have we become better in this country. So we need to continue the same path.
We have time for two more questions. And
yes.
Do you believe the presence of strong leaders within Malaysia who promoted domestic welfare has been a causal factor in the a lesser radicalization in Malaysia than other Islamic
The presence of what?
Strong leaders who promoted domestic welfare. You had mentioned earlier that they had strong leaders. You think that kind of reduced the radicalization in Malaysia compared to other countries?
The presence of strong leaders, did that reduce radicalization in Malaysia? I think one could make a strong claim for that. One could make a strong claim for that. I think that while satisfying or trying to satisfy the basic needs of the people, they have probably prevented some of the worst abuses that are possible in any kind of violent and radical ideology. So yeah, I mean, if you want more specific than that, we could talk about it, but I think that the answer should be as affirmative. And final question.
Sorry to do this, but a follow-up question on his. He asked the war on terror. Would you say a specific theater or all our efforts? And second question is, where then do we step in on this chart to prevent something like 9/11 happening again? You know, where we see just massive organizations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, remember that 9/11 wasn't committed by a massive organization. It was committed by one of the smaller. I mean, Al-Qaeda is one of the smaller Islamic organizations. In Indonesia, you have Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. One has 45 million members. The other one has 30 million members. You see, you cannot stop, you cannot prevent people from organizing mass movements in other countries. The question is, are we, but also are people in the Muslim world, able to perceive the threat that might come from some of these organizations? You know, some of the more violent, more radical groups. The first question, what was the first part of the question? A follow-up.
He asked, did you think the war on terror?
Oh yeah, was it? I think all around, if you look at it, it wasn't specific to Malaysia just. I think all around the Muslim world, this war on terror had infuriated Muslims all over. And especially, I think, until the invasion of Iraq, I think some people kind of, the Taliban, yeah, it might have been unjust to attack Afghanistan, but you know what? No one really liked the Taliban very much in the Muslim world. And they were not seen as a legitimate regime. You would recall that only a few Muslim countries have really recognized the Taliban, unlike Iraq, which was a recognized country, member of the United Nations. The invasion of Iraq was really the tipping point. That was really what infuriated so many Muslims.
Okay, sure.
Yes.
It's hard to get Professor Sinanovic to address this. Do I have to stand up?
No, you don't. No, you don't.
It's just a good question.
Because this gives me a better perspective, you know.
You can give me a one-liner, you know, on a religious kind of division, right? Does that perfectly coincide with the ethnic division? Are the Chinese sort of converging? Do you see that at all?
In Malaysia?
In Malaysia, yeah.
There is that cleavage.
So it's the Chinese.
It's reinforcing cleavage, which means that ethnic and religious lines are drawn. With the exception in the Indian community, there is a minority of Indians who historically came to Malaysia from the south, where there were Muslims, and so they were original. But in terms of conversions, there aren't that many conversions either way in Malaysia.
Okay. The second question, it seems to be a lot of questions have touched on that. That is, you talk about the idea that that you flow, you know, you know, you have.
You said you have quick question, one-liner.
Okay, you got me. Now, here's my question: what are the interests, you know, underpinning this kind of revival, Islam? The interest behind it.
Interest behind it. Well, I think it's not interest unless you define interest in terms of. It's more about honor and dignity, I think.
So about really not really interested as I see it economically.
It is related strongly to economic interest. There is no doubt about it. I mean, it often is. I mean, economics and it boils. There's something to old Karl Marx, you know, that he finds economics in almost everything we do, and I think it's hard to argue against it. The problem is here that I think it is primarily about honor and dignity. I mean, if you read Akbar Ahmed, who is now actually in our faculty book, Islam Under Siege, what's the subtitle? Something about honor. I cannot honor in the Muslim world. You'll find that a lot, especially after 9/11. This notion of honor and dignity being violated is really what, especially after 9/11, makes many Muslims to feel really negative about this whole issue of war and terror.
Okay. So you're going to be a very long answer. Now the final question, the three outcomes, right? How do you see the balance between amongst the three?
The balance?
Which one is gaining ground? Which?
I think the first two are really the vast majority. The violence, especially in Malaysia context, is almost non-existent. So it would be the first two. I think in the 80s, the accommodation part was stronger. I think right now, the opposition part is getting stronger.
No, but at right hand, is he, which part is he?
He used to be here, now he's here.
He's there, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions?
Of course, there's. I don't want to get the. I hope I'm wrong, but I thought there's also a great diversity within the Islamic community in Malaysia, right? It's not just a divide among ethnic lines. For example, Mahathir Mohamad, he went after Anwar. I mean, this is a famous case. So those are both. I think they belong to the same Muslim. I say the final question is not rule apply to you, but not me. But I'm going to ask one quick one. Now, you mentioned the concept of Islamic capitalism. Is that more like was that community-based like a Hamas, or was it very much like the Calvinistic, individual effort to connect the religion and the work and wealth? Both.
You can find both nowadays.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And next week we move to India. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.